Joining me now, attorney, legal analyst, Wendy Patrick. Wendy, in the Supreme Court right now, they've already heard arguments on this case, is one that comes from Arizona and involves a church and signs. Tell me about it.
That's right. And, you know, I can't resist, Graham. This case really is a sign of the times in that it relates to what kind of signage can somebody put up. Can a church, and in this case, this is what we call a sympathetic plaintiff, the Good News Community Church, 30 adults, 10 children. They don't have a church building, so they move around in different locations, and they want to be able to display signs so people in the community know where to go to worship. And they've been in a long-standing battle with the city of Gilbert regarding what kind of signs can they put up? What can the signs say? How many signs can they put up? So the Supreme Court has agreed to hear this to decide whether or not this church is able to include this kind of signage. And lots of other establishments are watching because this is going to have far-reaching implications depending on how the Supreme Court decides.
Right. Now, they've already heard oral arguments from what I understand, correct?
They have.
And we've, sometimes can get a glimpse into the soul of these Supreme Court justices by the questions that they ask and some of the comments that they mutter, Clarence Thomas aside, who never says anything on the Supreme Court. So what are we gleaning from that?
Well, a lot of things. There are some of the justices that really appear to be sympathetic with the church. And, you got to remember that part of the argument ended with, my goodness, being expressed by one of the justices in response to the city's lawyer basically saying, that wouldn't be permitted. And it was the question was, what if the sign said, Good News Community Church, 2 rights and a left, or some directionality?
Right.
But one of the other things that we noticed that makes it seem like they're sympathetic to the church is there was a lot of comparisons that the lawyers on both sides were trying to make. And the court did express that it's not fair to treat this kind of a sign like a political campaign sign. Part of the reason is, those signs get to stay up a long time because the political process takes some time to go through.
Right.
But on the other hand, you can't say that a church isn't allowed to use a sign because the service only lasts for 1 hour. So there were lots of examples that were made that gave some indication that at least some of the justices are sympathetic to the plight of the church and might come down on that side and against the regulations of the city.
So to the layman sitting from this seat, it appears this is not really a case about the First Amendment, but more possibly equal protection under the law?
Well, equal protection in a sense, because it's true, we have time, place, and manner restrictions, and a sign can't just say anything. But what they were looking at is whether or not, and again, there was an aesthetic value argument being made also. In other words, the signs were cluttering the roadway was one of the arguments, so that you got to look at that as well. But it is true that it's more than just equal protection. It also has to do with there is some social value that can be recognized in signs, and jurisdictions have some authority or some room to regulate that, but not to go as far, at least is the argument, as to say this little church can't put up a couple of signs that don't clutter the roadway, that aren't a traffic hazard, that tell the community where and when to go to worship.
Right, and the lawyers for the church are saying basically that, hey, they're being discriminated against here. Do you buy that?
Well, that they're hard-pressed to say that the city is saying they can't put up the sign because they're a church. Nobody has ever said that. No, that argument hasn't been made. But that's the implicit argument that they're trying to make. I don't know whether that's going to fly, just given all the other indications, especially since, obviously Gilbert denies that, but that's the issue. Is that enough? Is the denial that they're engaging in any kind of act of discrimination enough to save the city from having these ordinances that prohibit these kind of signs by the church?
And so the city's argument is that, hey, this is more of a nuisance. This is stuff that we have to pick up. It's a blight on the community. Is that what they're basically saying?
A little of all of that, Graham, because you remember when one of the justices inquired as to why they're regulating the sign, one of the lawyers said, well, there was a bunch of signs. So, and they do have these ordinances, the beautification ordinances. You can't have a bunch of any kind of sign. So it was interesting, the argument kind of, a little bit circular there. That's one of the many things they argued, but they did vehemently deny that they're discriminating against the church because it's a church.
And it's interesting to know that the Obama administration has joined the side of the church in the argument, which is kind of a rarity indeed, at least at the Supreme Court level. Wendy, thanks for your expertise.
Thank you.